The door slammed open, and the words cut through the freezing air like a blade. "Go back to your real mother." A 5-year-old girl named Emily, missing one leg, was thrown into the snow. Her crutches and metal prosthetic were hurled after her, clattering on the icy ground. She collapsed, shivering, her tiny hands clawing at the frost. From across the street, Jack, a war veteran, and his loyal German shepherd Rex witnessed everything. In that moment, the silence of the town was broken, and a story of courage and hidden kindness began. Before we dive into this true test of humanity, let me ask you this. Where are you watching from today? Please share your country in the comments below. If you believe no child should ever face the cold alone, stay with us until the end of this story, and may your day be filled with warmth and hope. The winter in Silver Creek had a way of silencing the world, covering rooftops, fences, and narrow streets under a relentless sheet of white that reflected every lamp's dim glow, as if the night itself were frozen in place. It was the kind of evening when no one lingered outdoors, when the cold bit through every layer of cloth and made the air brittle with sharpness. Inside a small wooden cabin on the outskirts of town, a fire crackled low in the hearth, spreading warmth across the rough-planked floor. Jack Carter, a 42-year-old veteran who had withdrawn from the bustle of the world, sat with his German shepherd Rex at his feet. The man's broad shoulders slouched beneath a faded olive jacket, his weathered face half shadowed by the flames. Rex, 5 years old, his coat a mixture of tan and black with a proud saddle of darker fur, lay coiled but alert, the calm of a soldier's dog never far from readiness. The silence was broken when Rex's ears pricked, his head lifting sharply as if a thread of danger had plucked an unseen string. His amber eyes flashed in the dim light, muscles tense beneath his fur, and a low growl rumbled in his throat, deep and warning. Jack leaned forward, following the dog's gaze toward the frosted window. Beyond it, the snow swirled violently under the street lamp, flakes tumbling like shards of glass in the air. Jack rose, sensing something was wrong. Years of service had trained him to trust both instinct and the animal beside him. Rex rarely growled without reason, and tonight his stance was rigid, his body half poised to spring. Then it came, clear and harsh, a woman's voice slicing through the storm with the cruelty of steel. "Go back to your real mother." The words hung heavy, unnatural, their malice amplified by the stillness of the night. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment he doubted his ears, but Rex's sudden bark confirmed the sound was real. Jack pushed the door open, stepping out onto his porch, boots sinking into the snow. His breath turned instantly to mist, and then his eyes caught the scene across the street, a sight that rooted him to the spot. There, in the spill of yellow light from a porch lamp, a small figure stumbled. Emily, a 5-year-old girl with pale cheeks and sandy hair cut unevenly at her shoulders, had been shoved outside. Her thin dress clung to her, entirely unsuited for the snow. She had only one leg, the other ending in a rounded stump that bore the marks of long struggle, and in the white powder lay her metal prosthetic and wooden crutches, tossed recklessly as though they were refuse. She fell, knees striking the snow, hands clawing desperately at the frozen ground. Her lips trembled as she sobbed, steam puffing with each broken breath. Behind her, framed by the doorway, stood her stepmother. Tall, with sharp cheekbones and black hair tied in a severe knot, she wore a cream sweater and tailored slacks, clothing more suited to indoor comfort than the icy porch. Her arms were crossed, her eyes narrow, her mouth twisted into a thin line of disdain. She shut the door with a violent crack, sealing Emily outside, leaving her tiny body trembling in the bitter air. The sound echoed like the final blow of a gavel. Jack's chest tightened. He knew the child's father worked shifts far from home, unaware of the torment his daughter endured. From behind closed curtains, a few neighbors glanced out, shadows moving against the glow of their living rooms. They saw the girl, the crutches in the snow, the cruel dismissal. Yet one by one, the curtains slipped shut, lights dimmed, and silence reclaimed the street. Fear or indifference kept them inside. Jack felt a familiar rage stirring in his veins, the kind he had learned to master in combat, but which now threatened to overwhelm him. This was no battlefield, but what he saw was a battle nonetheless, a child abandoned in the storm. He did not hesitate. The soldier in him moved before the man could think. Jack crossed the snow-choked street in long strides, Rex racing ahead, fur bristling, a growl building into a thunderous bark. The dog positioned himself between the child and the closed door, teeth bared at the memory of the woman behind it, his entire body forming a shield. Emily, startled, flinched, but then her small hands clutched Rex's thick fur, burying her face into his warmth as if the animal was her only refuge from the night. Jack bent low, his arms steady and strong as he lifted Emily from the ground. She weighed almost nothing, frail from fear and cold, her trembling body pressing against his chest. He wrapped his military coat around her, pulling it tight to block the wind. Emily's eyes, hazel and wide with terror, flicked upward, searching his face for some assurance that safety had returned. Jack gave her a brief nod, his jaw set, his eyes hard as steel. No words were needed. The gesture alone carried the promise that she would not be abandoned again. Rex circled them, barking once more, his voice echoing down the deserted street like rolling thunder. His paws dug into the snow, each movement fierce, as if he was daring anyone to step forward and test his loyalty. In that moment, the veteran and his dog stood as guardians in the storm, their silhouettes illuminated by the weak glow of the streetlight. To any who still peered through their curtains, it was a scene both humbling and unforgettable. A man who had once carried the weight of war, now carrying a child, a dog bred for strength offering the comfort of warmth. Jack turned toward his cabin, holding Emily close, his boots sinking deep into the snow with each determined step. The girl shivered beneath his coat, but her breathing began to steady as she clung to him. Rex trotted at their side, glancing constantly toward the house they had left behind, still bristling as though prepared for another attack. The night remained bitterly cold, yet within the circle of that small trio, something powerful stirred, a defiance against cruelty, a spark of compassion that could not be extinguished. By the time Jack reached his porch, Emily had stopped crying, her face buried against his chest, soothed by his steady heartbeat. Rex leapt up the steps ahead, standing guard, his breath puffing white into the frosted air. Behind them, the house across the street loomed dark, its cruel silence heavier than the storm. But here, under the glow of a single lamp, a different story had begun, one of courage, quiet sacrifice, and the silent heroes who refused to look away. The cabin was dimly lit, the fire in the hearth snapping softly as if it too was wary of breaking the silence. Jack set Emily down on a worn armchair near the flames, wrapping a wool blanket around her small body. She trembled still, her lips pale, her eyes glassy from cold and shock. Rex lay close at her feet, the dog's heavy body pressing against the chair as if to share his warmth. Each time Emily's shoulders shook, Rex nudged her hand with his muzzle, patient and steady, reminding her she was not alone. Jack crouched beside them, studying the child with the same intensity he once used to assess comrades in the field, searching for the lines of pain that ran deeper than any bruise. Emily lifted her eyes hesitantly, a flicker of fear lingering, as though she wasn't sure if she was safe even now. Her small hands clutched at the edge of the blanket, knuckles white. In a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke of her mother, a woman she barely remembered except through faded photographs and lullabies half forgotten. Her mother had died when Emily was very young, leaving only her father and the void that another woman quickly filled. But this stepmother, with her cold eyes and sharpened words, treated her as something broken, a burden too heavy to bear. Jack listened, fists tightening in his lap as the girl's fragile story unfolded. She told him of nights when she cried quietly in her bed, missing her mother, and how the sound of her tears brought punishment instead of comfort. She described being forced outside into the snow, her prosthetic leg and crutches denied to her, left only with the stump of her small limb pressed into the frozen ground. She spoke of the biting wind, the way her skin cracked, the silence of neighbors who looked away. Each word landed heavy, like a weight pressed onto Jack's chest. He reached out, steady but firm, and placed his calloused hand over her tiny fingers. His voice was low, gravelly from years of shouting over gunfire, yet softened by the ache of empathy. He told her she was not to blame, that no child should be treated this way, that the fault lay not in her tears, but in the cruelty of the one who twisted them into shame. Emily blinked rapidly, as if unused to kindness, and leaned ever so slightly toward him. Rex shifted closer, resting his great head on her lap, the steady thump of his heartbeat a counterpoint to the storm still raging in her memories. Jack's mind raced even as he kept his tone calm. He knew the child's father, a man often away for long stretches of work, believed his daughter was safe. Jack had seen him once or twice, a sturdy man with honest eyes, never suspecting the darkness that lived in his own home. The thought twisted Jack's gut. To fight wars abroad while danger thrived inside one's own walls was a betrayal of trust no soldier could abide. He vowed silently that the man would learn the truth, but for now, Emily's trembling frame demanded protection above all. While Jack grappled with the weight of her words, elsewhere another figure carried her own worries. Clara Johnson, Emily's teacher, was 32 with warm brown eyes and hair she often tied into a bun at the nape of her neck. She wore simple clothes, practical sweaters over skirts, her appearance plain but her presence gentle. For weeks she had noticed Emily arriving at school with purpled fingertips, her cheeks flushed raw from cold, her gait slower than usual as though pain lingered in every step. Clara had approached the child gently, but Emily had only smiled faintly and said nothing. That silence gnawed at Clara, who had learned to read what children did not say. Clara, too, had grown up in hardship. Her father, a mechanic with rough hands and a short temper, had left when she was still young, leaving her mother to hold the family together with scraps of work and endless resolve. Clara had vowed as a girl that she would one day become the kind of adult who noticed the quiet suffering of children and refused to look away. Now, faced with Emily's fragility, she felt the echo of her childhood promise stirring fiercely within her. That evening, after Jack carried Emily home from the snow, Clara sat at her desk grading papers, but found her eyes drifting constantly toward the notes she had taken on the girl's absences and ailments. She decided firmly that she would speak with Jack in the coming days. She had seen the way he looked after the girl, how Rex followed him like a shadow, and she knew he would not dismiss her concerns. Together, perhaps, they could gather what was needed proof that would silence denial and bring help before it was too late. Back in the cabin, the fire burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. Emily's small body, finally warmed, leaned against Jack's chest. He had moved to the couch, holding her carefully, the blanket wrapped tightly around both of them. Her breathing slowed, becoming steadier, though the occasional shudder still coursed through her. Rex positioned himself by the door, lying flat, ears perked, his entire posture one of vigilance. To any intruder, he would be a barrier of muscle and fangs. To Emily, he was a silent guardian whose presence promised safety. Jack stared into the fire, his arm cradling the girl as she drifted toward sleep. He thought of his own battles, the comrades he had held as life bled from them, the helplessness that had haunted him long after the war. Tonight felt different, yet the weight was similar. Here was another soul too small to fight, depending entirely on him. He whispered a promise she was too far gone in sleep to hear, a vow shared only with Rex's unblinking eyes. She would not suffer this cruelty again. Between the three of them, the bond was forged quietly in the hush of a winter night, a pact made not in ceremony but in need. When dawn crept pale and hesitant through the frosted windows, Emily was asleep, her tiny body secure in the veteran's hold. Jack's back ached from remaining still, but he did not move. Rex stirred only once, lifting his head to glance outside before resuming his watch. In that moment, though no witnesses marked it, two silent heroes had taken on a mission as grave as any fought on distant soil, to shield a fragile child from a storm more merciless than snow. The days that followed were brittle with cold, each morning dawning with pale light that filtered through ice-crusted windows, and each night wrapping the town in silence as though the snow itself muffled every sound. In Jack's cabin, the warmth of the fire had steadied Emily, but the veteran's thoughts remained restless, circling the child's words again and again. He knew the abuse could not remain hidden, and so he began preparing, his soldier's discipline turning into a quiet strategy. Rex followed him at every step, amber eyes always alert, his presence a reminder that watchfulness was not his alone to bear. The girl's father remained far away, unaware, while the woman across the street carried on with the same sharpness in her gaze, confident in the protection of silence. Jack purchased a set of discreet cameras, simple but reliable, their black lenses no larger than coins. He spent a morning fastening them to the edge of his porch, angled toward the neighboring house, and another to the post of his fence where they could watch without being noticed. The task reminded him of missions past, the placement of surveillance to reveal truths hidden in shadows. But this time the battlefield was a quiet street in Silver Creek, the enemy a household of cruelty. He worked methodically, Rex pacing nearby, sometimes sitting back on his haunches as though supervising with calm authority. When the last lens blinked to life, Jack exhaled, knowing the silence would no longer protect the guilty. Meanwhile, Clara Johnson moved through her days at the school with careful eyes. She greeted her students each morning with a smile, yet her attention often lingered on Emily, who shuffled to her desk slower than the others. Clara kept her records detailed, noting every raw patch of skin, every flinch when the girl brushed snow from her coat, every faint blue mark around her hands and cheeks. The teacher was not confrontational by nature, her manner always calm, but she knew the importance of evidence. Words from a child could be dismissed, but patterns recorded with precision formed a truth too heavy to deny. She stored her notes neatly in a folder, the edges marked by her tidy handwriting, her determination sharpening with every entry. Winter did not relent. Snow piled higher on the sidewalks, and the wind howled through the narrow alleys of Silver Creek with the voice of something ancient and merciless. Jack watched, waiting, knowing that cruelty repeated itself in patterns as predictable as weather. He spent his evenings reviewing camera footage, the glow of the small monitor flickering across his lined face, searching for moments when the mask of domestic peace slipped. Rex often lay beneath the table, his head resting on his paws, but every so often he would stir, glance at the screen, and give a low grunt, as though sharing his master's unease. It was late one afternoon when the moment came. The sun had already dipped low, casting the snow in hues of gray and gold, when the sharp sound of a door slamming carried across the street. Jack looked up from his work, heart tightening, and hurried to the monitor. The lens framed the porch of the neighboring house, and there it was, the woman's hand pushing Emily out, her face cold and hard, her lips moving in words of anger the camera could not capture. The girl stumbled forward, barefoot, her prosthetic absent, her small frame crumpling as her knees struck the snow. Her lips were blue already, her breath shallow wisps that vanished too quickly in the wind. Jack did not pause. He snatched his coat from the hook, the years of waiting collapsing into a single surge of motion. Rex was already at the door, barking furiously, the sound tearing through the silence like thunder rolling across the hills. They crossed the street in seconds, boots and paws breaking through the crust of ice. Jack's eyes burned with fury as he saw Emily collapse to her hands, her bare feet pressing into snow that seemed determined to swallow her whole. The woman loomed behind, her arms crossed, her face twisted into contempt as though the child's suffering was a lesson she believed righteous. Rex lunged forward, positioning himself squarely between Emily and the woman, his body tense, fur standing along his back, his growl vibrating through the air. His teeth flashed in the pale light, his stance unyielding. Emily's wide eyes found the dog first, and with a cry that was half sob and half relief, she reached for him, her small fingers clutching his fur as though it were a lifeline. Rex stilled, allowing her to press close, his warmth enveloping her even as his gaze never left the stepmother. The woman faltered, her composure cracking for a heartbeat, but she didn't move closer. Jack lifted Emily from the ground, her tiny body trembling violently against his chest, the cold already deep in her bones. He pulled his coat around her once more, shielding her from the bitter wind. The girl's head nestled against him, eyes closing, trusting without words. He turned on his heel, his jaw set, his eyes flicking briefly toward the camera above, knowing the lens had captured everything. The shove, the collapse, the child's bare feet sinking into the snow. Proof carved into pixels, undeniable and unmerciful. As he carried Emily back across the street, Rex trotting close, Jack's mind settled into clarity. He had what he needed. No longer was it only a child's trembling story or a teacher's worried notes. Now there was evidence that could not be explained away, a window into cruelty that had hidden too long behind polite smiles and locked doors. He laid Emily gently inside the cabin, wrapped her in blankets, and checked her breathing until her sobs gave way to quiet exhaustion. Rex curled around her like a sentinel, eyes still sharp, as if daring anyone to try to breach the safety of these walls. Later that evening, Jack met Clara outside the school, the winter sky already painted with stars. He handed her a copy of the recording, the small drive heavy with the weight of truth. Clara's hands trembled as she accepted it, her eyes glistening not only with sorrow but with resolve. She spoke softly, almost to herself, about how silence had ruled the neighborhood for too long, how the wall of indifference had protected cruelty instead of the innocent. Jack nodded, his voice low but steady as he told her it was time, that together they would break through that wall and bring light where cold shadows had lingered. That night, as the fire burned in the cabin and Emily slept under layers of warmth, Jack sat watch. His hands were steady, his thoughts sharpened to a single point. Rex dozed lightly at his feet, ears twitching at every sound beyond the window. The veteran's eyes did not stray from the sleeping child, and in the steady rhythm of her breathing, he found his resolve reinforced. The evidence was gathered, the silence broken, and the promise he had whispered in the dark was no longer only a vow. It was a mission. The winter sun in Silver Creek hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow across snowbanks that had turned gray at the edges from weeks of storms. The town seemed hushed, as if bracing for something long overdue, a reckoning that had been whispered about behind closed doors but never spoken aloud. Jack stood at his cabin window that afternoon, his broad frame stiff with anticipation, while Rex shifted restlessly at his side, ears twitching, nose tilted toward the wind. Across the street, the house that had hidden so much cruelty appeared ordinary to the casual eye, but Jack knew better. And today, the silence would finally be broken. Clara had filed her notes, the footage was ready, and the authorities had been called. There would be no turning back. Emily sat bundled in a thick blanket on the couch, her small body still frail from the cold nights she had endured. Her hazel eyes flicked anxiously toward Jack whenever she heard the faintest sound outside, and he reassured her each time with a steady hand and a calm voice. She clung to Rex whenever fear returned, burying her face in the shepherd's thick fur, drawing courage from his warmth and loyalty. Jack had explained gently that people would come today, that they would help, and though the child nodded, her trembling betrayed her lingering fear. He had seen such fear before in the eyes of civilians caught between war and survival, and he vowed again that she would never stand alone in that snow. By mid-afternoon, the quiet street stirred with the arrival of 2 official vehicles. A patrol car pulled up first, its tires crunching on the icy ground, followed by a white sedan marked with the seal of the county's Child Protection Agency. Out stepped Officer Daniel Hayes, a man in his late 30s with a square jaw and a heavy winter coat stretched over his broad frame. His expression was grim but not unkind, his eyes scanning the surroundings with the practiced caution of someone used to tense encounters. Beside him emerged Marianne Clark, a social worker in her 50s with kind lines around her eyes and silver streaks woven into her dark hair. She wore a wool coat buttoned to the throat, her presence quiet but firm, the sort of woman who had spent decades comforting children, yet never grew numb to their pain. Clara arrived moments later, her breath visible in the frigid air, clutching a folder against her chest. Inside were weeks of records, notes on Emily's condition, observations of her behavior, details that painted a picture far sharper than suspicion alone. She greeted Jack with a nod, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with resolve. For once, the quiet teacher's calm demeanor was matched by a fire that refused to dim. Jack handed her a small flash drive containing the footage, and together they approached the house across the street. The air seemed to hold its breath, the street lamps flickering on though daylight had not yet fully faded. The stepmother opened the door before they could knock, her tall figure framed by the warm glow of the interior. She wore a fitted sweater and dark trousers, her black hair twisted into a perfect bun, her smile practiced and brittle. "What is this about?" she asked, her tone cool, the edge of irritation already slipping through the mask. When Officer Hayes explained they had received concerns about Emily's well-being, her lips curled in disdain. "Concerns? I've been teaching the child resilience, discipline. Children these days are soft. What you've heard are tantrums, nothing more." Her words rang with false confidence, as though sheer insistence could transform cruelty into virtue. But the silence of denial was shattered when Jack connected the camera footage to a small monitor. The image filled the screen. The porch lit by harsh winter light, Emily stumbling barefoot onto the snow, her crutches hurled aside, her body crumpling under the cold. The timestamp glowed in the corner, undeniable, and the gasps of the neighbors who had gathered to watch carried like wind across the street. Clara stepped forward, her voice steady though her hands trembled as she presented her notes, page after page of evidence that told the same story. Marianne Clark examined Emily's feet in the warm glow of the cabin later, her face tightening at the sight of cracked skin and raw fissures. The truth was etched into every wound, every tear, every recorded moment. The woman's composure faltered as whispers rose among the neighbors who had once turned away. They saw not the polished volunteer they had believed, but the face of cruelty exposed in the cold light of proof. She tried once more, her voice raised, insisting, it was for her own good. Children must be hardened. The world is cruel, and she must be stronger for it. But her words fell flat, stripped of power by the images that contradicted them. The neighbors who had averted their eyes now stared openly, shame and anger mingling in their silence. Emily stood nearby, her small hands gripping Rex's fur as the German shepherd stood solid beside her. She whispered into his neck, voice trembling but clear enough for those closest to hear, "I just want to be warm." The simplicity of the plea pierced deeper than any argument, and the street fell utterly silent. Officer Hayes's jaw clenched, his hand moving toward his cuffs, the decision made without need for further words. Marianne placed a hand gently on Emily's shoulder, her eyes soft with sorrow, and Clara stepped closer, her expression a mix of relief and heartbreak. The stepmother did not resist when the cuffs closed around her wrists, though her eyes darted wildly across the crowd as if searching for some ally who would never appear. The click of the metal echoed louder than her denials, and the silence that followed was heavier than snow. For the first time, the people of Silver Creek did not look away. They watched, their faces solemn, as justice moved in quiet inevitability. Jack stood with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed and unyielding, while Rex's steady stance declared in silence that the child was safe now. As the patrol car pulled away, its lights flashing faintly against the falling snow, the crowd slowly dispersed. Neighbors returned to their homes, their faces etched with the weight of what they had witnessed, knowing they could no longer pretend not to see. In the stillness that followed, Emily clung tighter to Rex, her face pressed against his fur, while Jack placed a steady hand on her back. The mission was not yet over, but tonight, for the first time, the truth had broken free, and the wall of silence had crumbled into dust. The courthouse in Silver Creek stood like a stone sentinel against the lingering cold of winter, its walls worn by decades of trials both mundane and grave. Inside, however, the air felt charged, as though the community itself had gathered in spirit to witness a truth laid bare. The case moved quickly, propelled by evidence that spoke louder than denial ever could. Video recordings, school records, medical reports, and the testimony of neighbors who finally broke their silence. Jack sat in the gallery with Rex lying at his feet, the German shepherd's amber eyes fixed on the aisle, his steady presence reminding everyone that loyalty had no need for words. Clara, poised yet resolute, held her folder of notes, her expression a blend of sorrow and vindication. Emily was kept away from the courtroom, safe in the arms of a caretaker, spared the harshness of confrontation. The defense of the stepmother crumbled almost as soon as it began. Her attorney, a thin man with tired spectacles, argued briefly about discipline and misunderstanding, but the images were undeniable. The footage of Emily collapsing barefoot in the snow, the crutches flung aside, the timestamp blazing in the corner, left no space for ambiguity. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and hair pulled into a gray bun, listened without indulgence. When she delivered the verdict, her voice carried the weight of finality. Guilty of child abuse and endangerment, sentenced to years of imprisonment, with a lifetime restriction from contact with minors. The words struck the chamber like a hammer, and the silence that followed was heavy with both relief and grief. Outside, the air was cold but clear. Emily's father, Thomas Carter, had arrived from his long-haul trucking route only days before, a man in his early 40s with broad shoulders stooped by guilt. His sandy hair was streaked with gray at the temples, his blue eyes rimmed with exhaustion and tears he could not contain. When the verdict was announced, he collapsed to his knees in the courthouse steps, pressing his face into his hands. "I didn't know," he whispered hoarsely, voice breaking under the weight of absence. When Emily was finally brought to him, bundled in her coat, she hesitated for only a heartbeat before running into his arms. The reunion was raw, her small frame trembling as she clung to his chest, and Thomas wept openly, promising her again and again that she would never be alone. Jack stood a few paces back, his hands in the pockets of his weathered field jacket, watching with quiet gravity. Rex nudged closer, tail low, as though sensing the gravity of the moment. Thomas lifted his gaze toward Jack and crossed the distance, clutching his daughter tightly with one arm as he reached out with the other. "You saved her," he said, voice rough but filled with reverence. Jack shook his head slowly, his deep voice answering. "Rex did too. We only stood where we had to." The gratitude, however, did not waver. Thomas held Jack's hand in both of his, gripping it tightly as if words could not possibly measure what was owed. Spring thaw came slowly to Silver Creek. Snow melted in rivulets along the gutters, and the first green shoots broke the stubborn ground. In a quiet park by the river, Emily began her journey with a new prosthetic leg, polished metal glinting in the sunlight. She wobbled on the crutches at first, hesitant, her brow furrowed in concentration. Jack walked beside her, his steady hand hovering near her shoulder, ready to catch her at any moment, while Thomas watched with moist eyes, lips pressed tightly together in silent prayer. Rex bounded in playful arcs around them, circling back to nudge her hand with his nose whenever she faltered, his patience endless, his encouragement wordless but powerful. The first step was shaky, the second more sure, and by the third, Emily laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that split the air like the first bird call of spring. The laughter carried, echoing off the trees, and both men smiled despite themselves. Thomas wiped at his eyes while Jack's weathered face softened with pride. "You're stronger than you think," Jack told her gently, and Emily nodded, cheeks flushed with determination, as Rex barked once, sharp and triumphant, as if declaring her victory to the world. It was the beginning of a new rhythm, fragile but real, a season of growth planted in the soil of resilience. Clara, too, found a new calling. Moved by what she had witnessed, she gathered colleagues and volunteers to form a support group for children facing neglect and silent suffering. They met in the school library first, huddled over steaming mugs of coffee, their faces lit by determination. Flyers appeared on community boards, meetings grew larger, and soon families who had once been quiet began sharing their own stories. Clara's calm, nurturing presence gave the group its heart, while her precise records gave it backbone. Jack and Rex attended the gatherings as well, though Jack rarely spoke. Instead, he stood at the edges, his presence a shield, while Rex rested beside children who leaned into him for courage. The story of Emily spread quickly through Silver Creek, told in whispered conversations at grocery stores, recounted in sermons on Sundays, discussed in classrooms and town meetings. People began to understand that silence itself was a form of complicity, that to look away was to allow cruelty room to thrive. Neighbors who had once ignored the signs now carried themselves differently, more alert, more willing to intervene. The small town, once buried in quiet indifference, began to stir with collective conscience. Silver Creek was no longer just a place of cold winters. It became a place where warmth was fought for, where people learned that even the smallest voices mattered. On a bright morning, Emily walked across the park unaided for the first time, her new leg carrying her steadily as Rex trotted close, tail wagging like a banner. Thomas and Jack stood together, watching with quiet pride, while Clara snapped a photograph that captured her radiant smile. In that frame was the essence of what had been won: a child free to laugh, a veteran redeemed by action, a dog whose loyalty became legend, and a community transformed by their courage. Emily's laughter rang out again, brighter and freer than ever, a sound that seemed to lift the entire town with it. In the warmth of that spring, Silver Creek was forever changed. A little girl's courage, a veteran's vigilance, and a dog's loyalty had pulled an entire community from shadows into light. Where once there had been silence, now there was awareness. Where once there had been indifference, now there was compassion. And in the heart of Emily, small but fierce, bloomed the season of hope, proof that even the most fragile beginnings could blossom into something that changed the world around it. In the end, this story is not only about a little girl who found her smile again, but also about a loyal dog named Rex, and a veteran who chose compassion over silence. It reminds us that true strength is not in power or cruelty, but in kindness, in loyalty, and in the quiet sacrifices that protect the most vulnerable among us. The courage of a faithful dog and the humanity of a man became a shield that no storm could break, and through them, a whole community was changed. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below and tell us what you are thinking. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories of silent heroes and hidden acts of love. May God bless you and bring warmth to your home.